and welcome to the Software Engineering Unlocked podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michaela, and today I have the pleasure to talk to Michael Lynch, a senior software engineer and entrepreneur. But before I start, let me tell you a little bit about my latest projects, awesomecodreviews.com. Yeah, all my work on code reviews has now its own dedicated home. At awesomecodreviews.com, you will find articles about code reviews best practices, code reviews checklist, news about the latest research on code reviews, and of course, workshops and courses I offer around this topic. So please hop over to awesomecodreviews.com and check out my latest work. But now back to Michael. Well, Michael is a software engineer and entrepreneur. He has launched several businesses after leaving Google in 2018. Interestingly, it's not a software business that was his huge success, but rather a hardware, or let's say a combination, a hardware and software business that brought his real success. It's called Tinypilot. Today, I want to talk with him about his experience writing software for Google, Microsoft, and now for himself, for Tinypilot. And well, you probably know Michael as well because he manages to write articles, blog posts that frequently rank #1 on Hacker News. This means that they are reaching thousands, well, hundred thousands of people, and they read what Michael writes. So I'm really super thrilled to have him here with me today. Michael, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of yours and I'm following your writing, but not only on Hacker News, but also on your blog in general and, what you tell us about your journey as an entrepreneur. I have been there from, no, maybe not from the super start, but sort of from the start, I think 2018, 2019, something like this.
Yeah.
And one of the articles that I obviously love from you is about code reviews. Right? Mm-hmm. So you have this article that says doing code reviews like a human or something along those lines, right? So in your career as a software engineer, what are your thoughts on code reviews and what are your main tips or recommendations that you give to people about code reviews?
Sure. Yeah, code reviews are probably my favorite part of my career as a software engineer. And I feel like it's one of the best ways to learn as a software developer because you're just getting this detailed feedback from a teammate. And so I think that's incredibly valuable. And I think a lot of organizations underinvest in that. And I everywhere I've worked, I've tried to invest a lot in code reviews.
Yeah, I think that some people really love them and some people really hate them. And then there is a lot of in between, right? Can you understand why some people don't like them? Why they think code reviews are, a bottleneck or a problem?
I think if you don't like code reviews, it's probably something wrong with your organization. Like I think in the vast majority of cases where I hear people don't like code reviews, it's because the organization runs them badly. Like they use them, they allow senior software engineers to beat up junior engineers through code reviews. And that's, to me, definitely not the point of code reviews. Like code reviews should be about a shared sense of ownership. Like, how do we make this code the best it can? Not I'm going to show you how much smarter I am and force you into submission until you make your code look like mine. So a lot of the stories I hear from people who hate code reviews, it's something is wrong with their organization and they think they're experiencing it through code reviews, but the problem is actually something else that's kind of broken about the culture at the organization.
Yeah, that's also something that I often see, and I say it's just surfacing through code reviews, right? So the toxicity or these power struggles, they are just coming up, and I think also there is this part of beating up or power struggles or but there's also I think also this slowness and this bottleneck and this is also organizational and it's just surfacing in code reviews, right? People work in silos, they work very isolated, they're not really working as a team. And then you tell them, so now you use code reviews. And obviously it's not working, right? Because you're not used to show your code. You're not used to have small units of work. So you're working on that thing for 3 weeks, stressed out to show it to somebody that you're not really familiar with and you're normally not working with, right?
Exactly.
Then you throw the code over the wall and it's so much that they can't really say something about it. Right? But it's not really code reviews. It's something organizational. That's,
exactly.
Yeah.
And I think
what do you
better
think
code
about
review
that?
practice. Yeah, I agree. I think better code review practices, when I hear people say, oh, it slows me down, like, I think, yeah, if you're coming from a practice where like you write, 5,000 lines of code and then show it to somebody and you don't expect any feedback, it's going to be slower. But I think long term, you're going to save time just because they're going to forcing somebody to show it to another person and make sure it makes sense to another person is going to save time in the long run to make sure the code is maintainable. And I think a lot of the problems where like, okay, I've written 3,000 lines of code and now it's going to take the person 2 weeks to review it. And I mean, like, they can't effectively review a 3,000 line change list. But even if you're saying like, oh, it's so slow because like I used to be able to just check in and now I have to wait a day before every change list, I think that's fixable. Like, I think you can learn to write in smaller units, and then you can create a culture on the team that code reviews are high priority. So you don't let them sit for a day. You try to get to them within a few minutes or hours. So it's not this long bottleneck incentivizing the person to wait until they have a big chunk of code to send it to you.
Yeah, and I think incentives and rewards and all of that are in many organizations really centered around, having features ready
Yeah.
without review, right?
Right.
And then we just require them to review code, but we're not really rewarding people for it, or
Right.
we don't value it as much, right? We expect
Yeah,
it,
exactly.
but on the other hand, we're not investing in it. So
Right.
people, what should people do? They are torn apart between what I'm actually evaluated for, writing features and having code shipped, and
Right.
then there's this code review where there is no time allocated for it, and then
Right.
they're experiencing problems with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it has to come from the organization to realize that, yeah, like you're maybe going to pay a short-term penalty, but long-term, it's going to be worth the investment that you put in the short term.
Yeah. So you wrote code at Microsoft very long time ago, right?
Yep. Yep.
And then at Google, and now with your own business as well, right? So
Yes.
I know that you're also having developers that are working with you. So
Yeah.
how did the code review practice change in all those different settings?
Yeah. The biggest difference between Microsoft and Google was the tooling. When I was at Microsoft, it was in 2007 to 2010, and we didn't have like really any tooling around code reviews. You would just send a diff over email to somebody, and then they would respond writing the line numbers that they wanted to talk about just in another email. So when I got to Google, it was a few years later, and they had much better tooling. I think that Microsoft now has better tooling. I think, Michaela, you actually worked on that.
Yeah, true. Yeah. So I was there 2012, 2013, 14, and we had already code flow, and it was a code review tool, and it was quite good. Yeah.
Yeah. But in terms of the culture, I think Google was a little bit better in terms of rewarding code review and thinking that it's something worthy of investment. But I also think it varied a lot from team to team and from person to person. Like, I think some people would just, at either organization, would just kind of rubber stamp it. And it's funny because there was one of the developers that I worked with at Microsoft. I was my friend Matthew, and I thought of it as he taught me a lot about code review. And then like I talked to him, we were like, 10 years into our career, and I was like, yeah, you taught me a lot about code reviews. And he's like, no, you taught me a lot of it. Like, I thought I learned everything about code reviews from you.
Yeah.
And so it is funny. Like, I think it's hard to separate like how much of it is just me like trying to do code reviews the way that I want at different organizations, and thinking that the organization is feeding it to me. But I think code reviews for me have always been something that appeals to me a lot. Just like even in college, when I would have to do like peer reviews on somebody's essays and in a writing class, I would get really into it and want to write a lot of feedback. And so I think that's just my personality, like wanting to think a lot about somebody else's work and give them feedback. And so code reviews are a great tool for that.
Yeah. I remember when I was at Microsoft and I was writing my first feature, and it was actually for the code flow tool, so for the code review tool, and I was writing, a feature. And I know that I had to ship this code, right? And I was so grateful that I could actually have it reviewed before, right? So I was actually, I was learning a lot because I wasn't sure, like, are the practices now that I come with, are they what they people here do as well?
Right.
And, is that actually correct how I did it and so on, right? And I got a couple of comments that definitely helped. But in the end,
Yeah.
it was quite okay, and it was also a good feeling to know, okay, that
Yeah.
what I did right is actually,
Yeah.
I fit right in. Let's put it
Right.
that way
Right.
with how I'm doing it, right? And maybe a
Yeah.
tweak here and a tweak there, right? And so for me, it was a very positive experience and a very, yeah, definitely a little bit of a reassuring experience, right? So if I
Yeah.
would have shipped that, I would probably worry, and that's probably my personality, but I would worry quite a long time of, I shipped it, yes, but, nobody has seen it. Maybe they're not happy with,
Right.
what I did
Right.
here. But because you have this feedback mechanism and people
Yeah.
said, maybe here a little bit different, but here you did very well or something. I
Yeah.
knew that what I'm actually providing and what I'm doing, especially at the beginning, was good, right? And
Yeah.
so this was very helpful for me.
Yeah. I feel like that is such a great benefit of code reviews, that it's great for percolating practices across the team, and the good practices that somebody discovers manage to make their way across the team because they'll spread that in code reviews, and the good practices kind of have a way of bubbling up to the top.
Yeah. And so now it's a little bit different, right? Because now you're writing code together with developers that are, in your company, but
Yeah.
they're also, I guess, contractors probably.
Right.
Yeah. And so how is that? Did that change a little bit how you give feedback or how you use the tool, as as helping your business and your code base?
Yeah, I think it's been interesting because I'm the person hiring. I can influence the code review culture a lot more than I could on other teams. Like I think I generally was pretty good at influencing culture of code reviews on the teams at Google and Microsoft. But with this, it's like I'm picking people that sort of align with my views on writing code anyway. And so
Mm-hmm.
the company, like, it was interesting going from like just me as a developer to having another contractor to then having two contractors. And then I was trying to spend less time writing code and more time on management, just because, like, as a hardware company, there's so many moving parts. And I realized, like, okay, I'm still reviewing everybody's code. Maybe I should just have the developers review each other's code. And I was like, well, are they going to have the same standards that I do? Like, are they going to review it as rigorously? Because, like, they don't, like, part of it is like I'm long-term maintaining this code. And for contractors, they might not feel a sense of ownership because, like, contractor, you're less bound to the company than if you're an employee, and certainly much less bound than if you're the owner and founder. But
Mm-hmm.
I found that, like, after we had been doing code reviews for probably 6 months where I was doing all the reviews, and then once I started having the contractors review each other's code, it was exactly the same as if I had been reviewing the code. Like, I would sort of like peer over their shoulder and make sure they're not missing big things that I would have mentioned. But I found, like, I would look at their reviews and I'm like, this is exactly what I would say. And often they would find more things to improve than I would noticed. So that was a really big surprise. And I think that's sort of speaks to how well code reviews can kind of become a foundation of the coding culture. Like, once you establish a culture around code reviews, it sort of propagates itself and keeps those practices running.
Yeah, and I think also not only about code reviews, right, as a practice, but also on the values that you have on your code, right? How should
Mm-hmm,
the code
exactly.
base look like? How much quality, let's call it quality, but how much,
Yeah.
coding standards do we actually require
Apply.
from
Yeah.
our, yeah, apply or require,
Yeah.
exactly, right? And I mean, I'm working with a lot of different teams, and teams that have, I would say, lower standards, and there are quite
Yeah.
a few companies, right, that have lower standards that don't,
Yeah.
it's really still a big discussion if if it's important or not to have, readability, or if it's
Right.
important or not how we name things, or
Yeah.
that things are consistent throughout the code base, right? Not every
Right.
company, or also not every engineer, would agree that this is important. And
Yeah.
so I think code reviews are a great tool to communicate that as well,
Right.
or a poor tool to communicate that if you can't agree on the quality of your software, right? So then
Yeah.
every comment becomes through as nagging, right? Why are you even
Uh,
talking about this?
right. Well, I think that's a thing that's been interesting too, as a bootstrapper. Like, the timelines are very different. Like, code that I wrote at Microsoft, like, I worked on the Windows team, and that code is going to exist for 15 years. Like people have to maintain, I worked on Windows 8 and Windows 10. Like that lifetime is probably 10 or 20 years that somebody has to maintain that code. So there's a really big payoff to making sure that it's maintainable. And especially because it's also like kind of hard and expensive to ship patches to software like Windows. Whereas with software that I write now, like especially with a lot of my businesses that ended up not panning out, I sort of like am used to just writing in the style of Microsoft and Google, assuming that the code is going to be around for 10 years. And then I read Rob Walling's book, Start Small, Stay Small. And he was saying that like a lot of engineers have this fear of technical debt because they know that managers generally like will never let them pay down technical debt. They'll say like, oh yeah, we'll accrue some technical debt and then we'll pay it down later. And then that never happens because there's just a push for features. And he's saying, but if you're like, so you're naturally going to have that fear as a founder, but if you're the founder, you do control when to pay down technical debt. And so you can do like a shoddy job on something that's still experimental and ship it. And then once it causes problems, you can then go back and say, okay, like this is something I want to maintain for a while. I'm going to do this. I'm going to redo it, maybe like with more code reviews. And so I think as a founder with an indie business, you do have a lot of decisions, and that's hard. Like it's hard to give somebody code and say like, okay, drop your standards for this code review because this is just experimental code.
Yeah.
But I think there is room for like, it doesn't have to be, not all code has to be of highest quality, highest maintainability. Like, and I think that's an important thing to recognize as a founder. Like you have to, it's all engineering. Like you decide what things you want to invest in, what the payoff you expect it to be.
Yeah, true. And I think what you're discussing here, right, is now it's the conflict that you have within yourself as an engineer and as a founder, right? But it's actually the broader conflict that we also experience in other companies where we are the engineering team and then there is the CEO, right? Or, the product manager or something, right? And they are striving for going to market and, is it...
Yeah.
But the good thing is if you're the same person, it's easier for you to judge whether or not, when to make the call, right?
Yeah.
To make the call to write, a little bit more, like, let's say, faster code for the beginning or some prototype code or something like this. And when to say, well, now we really have to improve what we have.
Yeah, definitely.
On the other hand, I also had quite a few founders also that I talked that were discussing that, we started off with this business and then we were getting users that we didn't expect. And we were always, always on the edge to breaking, and we always broke, right? For every for every new step in growth that we did, right? Let's say 1,000 users, it broke because it was made for 10, right? And now thousands are accessing our system, and then 10,000, it broke again because it wasn't made for that, right? And so they're running behind growth wheel, which I think is a good problem to have.
Yeah, exactly.
Like as long as you manage, right?
Yeah, I think those are often fixable. Like you can invest more in fixing the bottlenecks, whereas I think people overinvest in things expecting it to scale to like 10 nines of reliability for their like startup that has 2 users, and it's got to be on Kubernetes and it's got to scale to like n different servers and 5 different backends. And so I think like especially if you're a bootstrap founder, I think it's important to learn the lessons of just like investing as little as possible to get up and running and then finding out where the bottlenecks and breaks are.
We could even start with no code.
Yeah.
Start, right? Like I always find it really hard, but it would be an option, right? Like
Yeah.
What I was thinking of now that you have a hardware business, how is that? Because it's not easy to ship batches, right? So if they have Tinypilot and they have probably some firmware that you're writing, or what kind of are you writing there? And then if you want to ship a new version, how are you going to do that?
Yeah, that was, I mean, this is a great example of what we were just talking about, of building like the simple thing and then waiting until it breaks. So yeah, I didn't know how to do that. Like I never built any kind of hardware before where like I have to ship updates to users. So originally the way I got code onto, so maybe I should introduce Tinypilot is it's a little device that you can plug into computers or servers, and it lets you control the computer remotely through your browser. So it emulates a mouse and keyboard and it captures the input. And so I built it using the Raspberry Pi, the little single board computers. And so I'd never really done any engineering on top of the Raspberry Pi before for a consumer product. And so when I first shipped it, like I had no idea if anybody was going to buy it. And so the way that when I was developing the prototype, I used a tool called Ansible that it's usually for like configuration management for servers, where it just creates an SSH connection, then moves some code over to the server. I was like, okay, that's fine. I'll use that. And so when it came time to like, it's open source. So when it came time to explain to users how they can install it on their Raspberry Pis, I was like, okay, I'll create like a really simple bash script that bootstraps a little Ansible environment and uses Ansible to install the software to itself, which is very unusual. Like nobody does that, and for good reason, which I later found out. But I didn't know any other way to like. I also like had no the typical way you install software on Linux is using like apt-get or something. But my software, like because it had to change the kernel a little bit, apt-get was kind of hard to do. But Ansible worked, and so I did that. And then like I found that okay, now that users have that, they want to interact through the web interface. They have to like my instructions for how to update were still to like create an SSH connection, then update, which users didn't want to do. So then we had to iterate on that, and then like now we're to the point where like the Ansible installations take like 10 minutes. And now we're trying to figure out like, okay, like let's back up a little bit and figure out how to do this through like the more standard tools. But we lasted for 2 years. Like looking back, maybe it's something we should have invested more in to do it like right the first time, because it is a little bit hard to unwind. But yeah, it's hard to predict those things. Like my friend David Toth, who's another indie founder, he's really helped me think about like what things you should invest in, because it's like you can overinvest in anything. And the way he's found to choose what to invest in is like things that you can't undo later. So like something, like the color scheme is probably the easiest thing to change. Like if you have a web app and you say like, oh, I don't like this color scheme anymore, it's very simple a week later to totally redo the color scheme. But something like a choice of database, that's pretty hard to change. If you like use a NoSQL database as your backend, and then later on you realize that you actually want like a SQL based backend, then that's a really difficult decision to change. So you have to budget more time to think about those investments, the things that are like going to be really hard to change later on.
And I can imagine, right, the Tinypilot, the first users, right, the more the curious people, right, and also the tech savvy people, right, so you can also burden them a little bit with some tingling and so on. So that's probably what I think, right? But now that it's getting more widely used, I guess there are more users. Definitely. You want to get a bigger user base. People also that want plug and play, right? The easier installment and so on. Is that something that you now try to provide more for? Did you see how the customers that you attract change over time? Maybe that's my question.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it wasn't, I think it was like changing the way that we presented the product and changing the way it worked was a good way of going up market. And because at the beginning it was like I launched it on Hacker News, and a lot of people that bought it, a lot of them could have built it themselves. Like I didn't have anything special at that point. It was just like, I can sell you a kit of all the things that you need to build it, and I'm giving you the software is free anyway. So I think a lot of those people just bought it to support me. And then like, as it went, I offered more like custom case, and then like had it more like custom built so that it was more of a plug and play solution. And then I think as I did that, more businesses rather than like home hobbyists started to become interested, because it's like they want like, I think the hobbyists love to tinker and like don't mind like, oh, I have to SSH and run from the command line. And I think the businesses are just like, I want something that I like, the idea of something that I don't want to tinker with it. I just want it to work. So yeah, over time we've tried to make it more for the people that like don't care about tinkering, while still making it friendly to people that like want that extra power.
Yeah. And so did you see that the kind of support requests that you're getting are different now? Do businesses send more support requests or less support requests, or is that all the same?
Businesses tend to, I think a lot of people observe this, that like the more the business spends, the less support they request, which is like the opposite of what you would expect. Like you'd expect, oh, they're spending $10,000 with us, they're going to like expect a lot. But usually if they're spending $10,000, it's a very small amount to them. And they have people on staff that like can figure things out. Whereas it's the business that are like very budget conscious, where they're like, we spent $350 on your product, and that's a huge deal for us, so we expect the moon. And so like they tend to be more demanding and like want a little more direct support. But yeah, like that's been a whole other journey of just figuring out ways to manage customer support, because at the beginning it was just like all the customer support was like, just email me, like I'll respond to any support requests. And then that very quickly became like I was spending 4 hours a day just responding to emails, and most of them were like the same email.
Yeah.
So I've had to figure out ways to make that scale better.
So how did you do that? What's your way?
So there were a lot of things. So the first thing I did was to add a support forum, and that was a big help, because I was seeing like, okay, a lot of these questions are repeating. Actually, I think the first thing I did was add an FAQ, because it was much easier to say like, okay, instead of like rewriting this answer every time, I'll just write it once really well on my website and then point people to that article. And then it would let people solve their own problems if they ran into something. And then the next thing I did was add a support forum, where, because the problem with doing it over email is it's siloed. So like you answer the question once and then nobody else can see that answer. But on the forum, it tends to force everything out into the open. So like if somebody else runs into the same issue later on, it doesn't cost you extra because they can easily search and find the same solution before. Then I started adding local staff that handle the fulfillment. So they ship out orders and everything. And then I realized like, wait, they could be answering these emails too. Like I had for a long time thought like, oh, like a lot of these emails are technical, like, and the fulfillment staff, you know, they don't have experience with Linux. They're not gonna be able to answer these questions. And I realized like probably like half of the requests have nothing to do with tech support. It's just like, hey, I didn't get my tracking number, or like, hey, like, you know, I need to update my address or something like that. So very easy for somebody without a technical background to solve. And then the last step was adding somebody who does have Linux experience. So I hired a support engineer earlier this year. And so that's like all those things together have made it so that like I end up only participating in maybe like 10% of support requests. So it's most things are pretty easy for the staff to handle. And then we're always trying to make it like keep things scaling. So like if there's a consistent issue that users run into, they have to read the FAQ, like we try to make it so, okay, like how can we change the product so they don't have to add that? One of the like interesting ones was at the beginning, we would get a lot of questions like, oh, Tinypilot captures HDMI output, and we'd get a lot of requests like, oh, what do I do if I have VGA output? And so we'd say, oh, like just use a VGA to HDMI adapter. Like we've tested this one, that's fine. And then I realized like we could just sell that. Like we just have like a checkbox in the order saying like add a VGA to HDMI adapter. And so then like that made those questions go away. And like a lot of the customers now just will buy that from us. So yeah, we try to like figure out ways like how can we change the product? How can we change the website so that the users don't have this question in the first place?
Yeah. So coming back to the software on Tinypilot, you talked about code reviews, and the code reviews that now that you actually use code reviews, you were able to have them on the same standard as you were expecting, but also that you probably, maybe not for Tinypilot, but for your first attempts in different, you know, products and SaaS businesses or whatnot, right? What you're trying out as a founder, as an indie founder, you have different kind of standards on quality. What about unit testing? Do you have unit tests for Tinypilot? Do you have unit tests for your other projects? Are they always necessary? Do you have system tests, integration tests? What do you think about testing?
I love testing. I'm a huge fan of unit testing. And so for most code that I write, I have unit tests. The exception is like I'm not very good at writing unit tests for front-end code. So like stuff that has to interact with the, like, I know there are ways of doing it, of like loading components of your page and unit testing that in isolation. I've never learned how to do that. And I also like, it hasn't ever come up as like something that misses bugs, but generally with almost all of my projects, I'll write unit tests because I feel like they pay for themselves so quickly. Like, especially when it's something that like you have to parse user input or something, I feel like it's so much easier. Like once you have the unit tests in place, it's so much easier to just keep running your unit tests than to keep having to manually test things. So I tend to write a lot of unit tests, even for things that I don't expect to last very long. I'll typically write end-to-end tests using Cypress. Cypress is a tool for browser automation, and it's pretty easy to just, I have this standard setup that I use where I run it under Docker. And so as long as I can run my app under Docker, I can run Cypress in one Docker container and my app in another, and then they just talk to each other, and it works pretty well. So I tend to write a lot of unit tests. Actually, ironically, Tinypilot is the place where I probably have the least test coverage, because the tooling is pretty hard. It requires, because if you think about what Tinypilot does, like it has to run it requires like special functionality in the Linux kernel that is only available on certain hardware. And so Raspberry Pi is one of those. So it has to change the kernel so that it can emulate a keyboard and mouse, so you can't really do that. Like if you just throw that on GitHub Actions or Circle CI, like you can't test that functionality because you can't modify those kernels. And then your test, the real functionality is like, if I type this key, does it show up on the remote system? And that's very difficult to like, you'd have to like have a very complicated test setup to test that functionality. It's doable. And like, I've thought about ways of doing that, but we don't have end-to-end tests. And the end-to-end tests that we have now are like, for a long time, it was just, I had a long Google document explaining like how to test every single feature that I would do before every release. So it would take me like about a full day to test a release. And then I handed that over to the fulfillment staff that they handled that. We do have unit tests. So for the web backend is written in Flask. And so that part is very like just testing the REST endpoints and a lot of the low level code. That's very easy to unit test. So we have pretty good unit test coverage there, but we don't have end-to-end tests. And that's something that like I'm kind of ashamed of, and always think like, oh, like maybe we should take it. If we took probably 2 or 3 months, we could get end-to-end tests up and running. But it's like, do we really want to take a feature freeze just to get to that point? And yeah, it's hard. I love testing, so it pains me that we don't have end-to-end test coverage for that. But I don't think it's worth the investment yet.
Yeah. So for me, tests are regressions are the reason why I have tests, right? So the confidence that unforgettable me, right, going back to the code that I wrote, I don't know, a week ago, or let's say half a year ago, right? Like this is like somebody else wrote it. And then needing to remember, does it have a side effect? Maybe something else, like collapses now. So is that something that, do you feel that you want Tinypilot to be tested just because you want it to be tested and it's your standard? Or would it really help you with that? Like that you say, well, my confidence is, now increased because I have those tests.
Yeah, definitely. Because there have been bugs where there's some subtle regression where like this dialogue now doesn't pop up because we changed something in the front end. And so having those tests be manual like does give me that confidence, like the same confidence that I would have if they were automated tests. But it's still like it's very costly. It still costs a human 30 minutes to run those tests, and then I review those tests to make sure like I don't see anything that looks odd in the test output. So I'm still getting the same confidence, and like that definitely is important to me, to have the confidence that we're not shipping something out to users that's just like completely broken. And even with those tests, we've discovered gaps in the test where we do ship something where like some combination of functionality doesn't work, and we're like, oh, that was embarrassing, and then we update our test plan so that we make sure that we always include that in the future. But yeah, like as the test plan gets longer and longer, I'm more and more interested in automating it, or at least automating some of it. But like the problem with something like this is like the big investment is just getting the test set up, like just getting to the point where you can write your first test. And then once you have
because probably then it's straightforward, right? If you have that,
exactly.
If it works. Yeah. I was doing dynamic and static analysis and was, working with the Eclipse ecosystem and things like that. And also there, the system tests and so on, they were not that straightforward because I was also, changing the system internally and so on. So I have a little bit an idea of how difficult, not completely because it's not hardware then, but it was still not straightforward, right? It was not that you just could use JUnit and, it just runs out of the box or something. So how do you think about this? Do you think about it, okay, now we are spending, let's say, half a day every week, and then you calculate how many days that is and weigh that up with how much you estimate that it will take to write that test, the test runner?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest bottleneck, I think of the software in terms of feature velocity. Like I want to be able, like I want us to have maintainable code and like code that the developers enjoy working on. Like I don't want it to be a pile of hacks, but I also want, like, I think part of that, like you can't just make beautiful code. Like you can't just refactor forever. Like I think users and also developers expect to like continue shipping features. And so it's a question of like, okay, how much developer bandwidth are we losing to tests? Because like if we had automated tests, we could just run them on every commit and find out very, very quickly if we broke something. Whereas like if it has to go to a tester and then the tester reports back, we can only afford to do that. Like, it just logistically, it's hard to do that more than like once every few weeks. And so there's a long turnaround where it's like, okay, so this broke. What change broke it? And so
root cause analysis. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Yeah. So like that happens infrequently enough that it hasn't been a strong push for us to like automate everything. But I think like as we add more features, it necessarily makes it more complicated to test, and then that pushes us more in the direction of like, okay, like when can we start automating some of this testing so that we're not relying on a human to manually run through all the features?
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about another topic, and that's introspectives, right? So,
Sure.
introspections, because I know that you're writing this. I'm subscribed to your newsletter, right? So every month I get sort of Tinypilot, this and that, right? So I always can follow what happened to you, but you don't also do it on a weekly basis.
Right.
And on a monthly basis, and then annual and so on, right? I looked at the weekly ones, and there are even ratings. So you're rating yourself, how well you did in an area and so on.
Yeah.
So why you do that? What is that actually? Maybe you explain a little bit what it is better than I did right now.
Sure.
And then why are you doing it?
Yeah, I got the idea from this tool at Google called Snippets. So it wasn't universally used, but it was just like a very simple tool. It was just like a markdown field where at the end of the week, you could write down what you did that week. And then the following Tuesday, it would get emailed to all of your teammates. And then anybody could subscribe to your snippets if they just wanted to see what you're up to. So sometimes like a partner team would subscribe to your snippets just like as an easy way to get updates on what was going on. A lot of the value was also just the first 2 or 3 years I was working for a manager who was in California when I was in New York. And so like he didn't have a lot of natural insight into what I was doing. And so the weekly snippets helped him understand what I was working on each week. And then previous companies, like our status meeting would be like, I would have to explain like what I had been doing since our last status meeting. Whereas this was like, they already knew everything I was doing because they'd been reading my snippets. And I thought that was such a great tool. It was also good at promotion time when you had to like go back and review all your accomplishments for the year and figure out like, okay, like what am I going to use as evidence for the promotion team? And it was funny because I switched managers, and then I found out that my new manager wasn't even reading my snippets. And my reaction was like, oh, then like, why am I even writing these? And then like 2 weeks later, I was like, oh, they're good for me. And so I just ended up writing them anyway, even though my manager wasn't reading them. And then when I quit Google, like the first week after Google, I opened a Google Doc and just started writing them for myself. And yeah, I just find it it's very easy, like especially for a developer, to end a week feeling like, oh my gosh, I didn't get anything done. Like if you spent the whole week like trying to debug a difficult bug in your app, you're just like, oh, I nothing happened. I spent the whole week doing that. And I would often feel that way. And then I would go back and like when I write my snippets, I call them what got done. I would look at what code I checked into GitHub. I would look at my outgoing and incoming emails. I would look at my calendar. And so it forces me to kind of take a more objective view on what I did for the week. And I'd be like, oh, wow. Like, so there would be weeks where I feel like I got nothing done. I just spent the entire week debugging this one thing. And then I was like, wait, that was actually just the last 2 days. On like Monday and Tuesday, I shipped this big feature. And it feels like so far long ago that I've forgotten it, but like forcing yourself to go back and review it's very satisfying. It like makes me feel like, oh, like even weeks where I feel like I didn't get a lot done, it's because I'm seeing it through this like very down on myself perspective. But if I look at the facts, I realize I actually got a lot done.
Yeah. And there's this one part, right, where it's a memory aid, right, where you see actually, all of those things got actually done. And I mean, I really have a hard time with to-do lists.
Yeah.
because I always do things and
Right.
then I can't write them. So I normally, you know how, how my day starts. I open up my to-do app. I
Hmm.
write down 5 things that I have to do. While I'm doing this,
Hmm.
I'm thinking about something that I really have to do. Instead of writing down that I have to do that, I do it. And then when I
Yeah.
have done it, I don't add it to the to-do list anymore, right? And so,
Yeah.
and while I'm writing my to-do list, I do all the things that are really important. And then I have five
Yeah.
things still on this thing that I haven't
Yeah.
done, right? And like, this is so frustrating.
Right.
And so I like this that you change it, right? You write about what you have
Yeah.
done instead of what you have to do. But what about the valuation of it or evaluation, right? Where you think about, could I have done that better, or was I
Yeah.
what I expected? Because you're also doing that, right? So you're
Yeah. Yeah, I find that helpful as well. So in my monthly retrospectives, I'll at the end of each retrospective, I'll set goals for the following month. So I'll usually publish my retrospective in the first few days of the month, and I'll say like, okay, at the end of this month, these are the 3 things that I want to achieve. And I think especially as an indie founder, it's easy to kind of like lose sight of the high level goals, and like you can think at the beginning of the month like, okay, I want to ship this thing, but then you get so into like, oh, I really want to polish the UI, so I spend a week on that without really thinking about whether that contributes to my larger goal. And then like the month ends, and if you're not thinking about like, did I hit my goals, you can just think like, oh, okay, like I didn't ship the feature, whatever. Like you maybe don't even like take a breath to think about whether you met your goals because you didn't set them to begin with. And so I
yeah.
find that like if you're a founder, there's so many possibilities. I think that's the thing that a lot of people miss if they have never worked outside of like a standard employment situation. Like if you're in charge of deciding what to do, like there's infinite possibilities. You can invest more in marketing, you can invest more in engineering, you can invest more in hiring. And so like there's so many things you could do. And if you don't set specific things that you're trying to achieve, like you could go down the rabbit hole on something that doesn't matter. Like
Mm-hmm.
you can spend a month polishing your website, and like the website, if you really sat down and thought about it beforehand, like you would probably realize that like the website probably isn't the thing that's preventing you from gaining new users or getting new customers. And so I think like having these goals, and then like thinking about at the end of the month, like, okay, like did I hit these goals? And then like if I didn't, did I have good reasons, or did I just get distracted and like forget about my goals? Or like what I think it's helpful to just take time to evaluate like, why didn't I meet this goal? And
Yeah.
like what can I do in the future to help me like achieve my goals better?
And do you think about these goals more activity driven or more output or outcome driven? So do you think about, oh, I want, 10% growth of Tinypilot users? Or do you think about, oh, I want to make that feature?
Yeah, I try to balance it because it's hard. Like I do sometimes set goals of like, I want to reach this number in revenue. Um, because yeah, like you don't have full control. Like you can work as hard as you want, and like sometimes you can't. You just there are other circumstances that prevent you from getting to
Mm-hmm.
70K in revenue for the month, or whatever it is. So I think if it's all goals that are driven by that, like you don't ultimately control, that's very difficult. And so I try to balance it with like certain things are like entirely within my control. Like I know if I focus, I can do those things. Like it doesn't depend on the response from external factors.
Yeah, and I think probably you also have like maybe this is my goal, right? The goal is to have 10% more users, and then the
Yeah.
activities that somehow, okay, because I want this goal, I'm going to do X or Y, right?
Right.
So let's say the next 3 months, I'm trying to implement 2 new features because I think this will give me, those 10% of users. And then you
Right.
can look at, did it actually, let's say we are managing to do this 2 features and we don't have the 10% of more users, we can think, oh, well, maybe we should have the, purchase flow optimized or
Right.
something, right? So next time we
Right.
have maybe the same goal, but the different activities to reach that,
Right.
right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that is the other thing that's useful for like the high level goals. Because if your goal is like, I want to add this feature, and then it turns out that like adding the feature takes 3 times as long as you expected, it isn't it probably isn't worth pursuing that goal if like your real goal is to increase growth by 10%, or like get another like double your user base by the end of the year. Like your goal isn't like, yeah, your goal is like the ultimately the growth, and not like the low level things you want to do to get there, because it could
Yeah.
turn out that it's more expensive than you thought or not as effective as you thought.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to come to something back, and probably my last question for you. And this was when we were talking about code reviews, and you were talking about culture, and you said, I'm pretty good in influencing culture. So
Yeah.
I want to know how are you good in influencing culture? How did you influence culture at Microsoft or Google? I mean, these are large organizations, and
Yeah.
I would say pretty hard to influence, right? I mean, probably depends also a
Yeah.
little bit on your team, but how do you go about influencing culture there? If you see, well, code reviews could be improved or done differently, how do you do that on a team?
Yeah, it's something I didn't realize I was good at until like maybe like 10 or 15 years into my career. But I think I was kind of doing it accidentally. So the first thing I think is important to do when you join a new, so I'm good at influencing culture like on my team. I'm not good at like influencing the CEO of Google to do what I want. But I think I was historically pretty good at like getting people to invest more in code maintenance stuff, like getting people to invest more in code reviews and testability and maintainability and stuff. So the way I found that's effective to do that is when you join a new team. It took me a long time to realize this, but the first thing you should do is shut up and just listen to other people and just kind of find out like what the dynamics of the team are, what problems people are having. Because if you come in with a lot of opinions and you're saying like, oh, you do code reviews like this, like I think you should be doing them like this, you're now like the annoying one that's like thinks they can boss everybody around without really proving themselves. So I think like the first thing you have to do is just kind of figure out the dynamics of the team and like understand who has influence on the team, like what the pain points are that people feel. Because if you're somebody who's like a code review zealot, but everybody on the team like really hates code reviews, then your first battle probably shouldn't be code reviews. Mm-hmm. And then I think the next thing that's important to do is do something like make a contribution to the team in the domain of things that you care about that is sort of like indisputably valuable. And so one of the things that I would often do when starting on a new team is to write new hire documentation. So I'd say like, hey, I'm like ramping up, like, is it okay if I write documentation just outlining all the things that a new team member has to do? And like, it's pretty hard to say no to that. Like why you expect to hire more people. So like, that's obviously a good thing. And also like when you join a team, people don't really expect you to do that much because it's like, oh yeah, they're still ramping up. And so like, if they see that you're spending time writing the ramp up documentation, that's very valuable. And it's like, okay, like this is a person that like isn't invested in helping the team. They're going to do things more valuable. And then after that, like I think a few months in, you can start to think about like, okay, like what's like a low risk thing that I can contribute. So like redoing the code, like if there's no code reviews and you're like, everybody has to do code reviews, like that's a pretty big risk. So you probably don't want to start with that, but something like, oh, we don't have continuous integration. Like let's add continuous integration. Cause that's like, there's not a lot of ways I mean, there are ways that can go badly, but like usually it has a really high amount of value and like people are going to see that. And so I think like during this process, I don't know if you've ever heard the term social currency, but it's like you're making yourself valuable to the team and like making it like so that you seem like a credible person so that later on when you're recommending things that are more risky, that people are going to have more trust in you because you have this track record of delivering things that have been valuable to the team.
Yeah.
And then I think like a few months in, when you've had this track record of like, okay, you've had like a few small bets or like a few low risk things benefited the team, then you can start pushing something that's like a little bit more controversial. So a thing that I would often do at Google is push teams to do design reviews because like a lot of teams didn't take design. They would take code reviews very seriously, but they didn't take design reviews very seriously. And I think there's a lot more bang for your buck in reviewing design documents. And so, but everybody hates design documents. So that's a thing you need a lot of social currency to push for. And I think with that, it's like very important to take time to gather everybody's feedback and say like, okay, like what should, like, it's not you just decided something and you're pushing it on your team to influence culture. It's like, what do we all collectively want out of this process? Like what value do we expect to get from it? What do we have to invest to get that value? And then I think it's also important to like keep the team involved. So like, okay, I've written this process, like how do people feel about this? And then like once you've been doing it for a few months to like schedule another review, like, okay, we've been doing design reviews, like how do people feel like it's going? Like what are the things that we can improve in that process? So those are things like I found that are very useful for getting credibility and like being able to influence the team.
Yeah, and so when I listen to what you explained, is there's the social aspect, right? That you're getting credibility, that you're getting points with your team, that they are trusting you. But also, it seemed to me that you were talking about things first that you can do, right? So it's on your shoulders, and then you actually ask them also to contribute, because you can't, you know, you can be the only person that sets up the CI/CD probably, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
that's your extra hours that you're maybe putting on. But then if you want them to review design documents, it's not you, right? It's not useful if it's only you. So you have to ask others. Is that also this gradual thing that first I'm investing my time, and then I'm thinking more of, can I ask others to contribute time as well to something?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point. Yeah, like I think as you're like accruing social currency, like part of that is being able to get people to take time themselves, because like with new hire document or CI, it's like, okay, sure, you can do that. Like it costs me nothing, and like it doesn't really seem like there's a downside. And then things like, oh, we should change our code reviews, or we should change our design reviews. Then it's like, okay, well now you're asking me to do something. Like, do you have credibility? Do you have credit on the team where like I want to take this risk with you?
Yeah. And then also I wonder if I say, well, let's say I'm writing this new hire document, okay, maybe this is something that you already have to go through it, so it's really hard to say no. But maybe for CI/CD, I can see that people say, oh, you know, rather not do it, focus on this. Are you then doing that outside in your own time, or do you ask for permissions to do it on your work time? Do you want people to see that as a positive contribution to your to your career or to your performance?
Yeah. I think when I get like early on, when I get resistance, I try to figure out, okay, like I don't want to like battle on something early on. So I try to figure out like, okay, like you don't like CI, like, is there something else? Like maybe reducing our alerts. Like, is that something that you think would be valuable? Like, is that worth me investing time into? So yeah, like I think you could also set it up, like try to do it anyway, and like show.
But you're looking for buy-in, right? So even though you're investing your time, you're looking for buy-in, right? So you're asking around and seeing if people are seeing that as valuable as well, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, cool. So Michael, I had really good time talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing all your insights about testing, code reviews, also entrepreneurship a little bit. I will obviously link all your cool stuff, but is there something else that you think is important for my listeners?
No, you can follow me. My blog is mtlynch.io, and I'm on Twitter @deliberatecoder.
Very cool. Yeah, I will link everything in the show notes. Thank you so much, Michael, for being on my show.
Thanks, Michaela.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye. This was another episode of the Software Engineering Unlocked podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please help me spread the word about the podcast. Send the episode to a friend via email, Twitter, LinkedIn, well, whatever messaging system you use, or give it a positive review on your favorite podcasting platforms such as Spotify or iTunes. This would mean really a lot to me. So thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will talk to you in 2 weeks. Bye.